The work that I'm involved with is more at catchment, at river basin scale. So it's trying to do the best we can. For us, it's within the Thames, to hold as many eels in it as possible that can grow up and migrate back to the Sargasso.
Welcome to another episode of Rewilding the World. I'm Ben Goldsmith, and I am with Joe Pecorelli from the Zoological Society of London to talk about eels, amazing eels, and particularly European eels. I, in fact, only saw my first eel, Joe, about 6 weeks ago, if you'll believe it. I put a fish trap into my pond to see what we've got. And in among the rudd and a few tench, there was this beautiful, wriggling, I think probably not quite yet full-grown eel. And it was the first time I'd ever seen one myself. But I had read The Book of Eels, which was a book written by Tom Fort in 2002, which is a really fantastic book that explores the life cycle of this extraordinary animal and efforts to figure out where they go and where they breed and how it all happens. Eels are now critically endangered, and it's Joe's life's work to save them and restore them. Joe, thank you for taking the time to join me today.
It's an absolute pleasure. It's lovely to meet you, Ben.
Joe, so let's start straight away with eels. And if I understand correctly from the book I've read, the eel that lives in the pond on an average village green or up in the headwaters of any one of our rivers sits there for a decade or whatever it might be, and then one winter it turns a vivid blue and leaves the pond at night and slithers along the ditch and along the catchment into the stream, down into the river, into the estuary, and then, along with countless others, makes its way across the Atlantic to breed. I mean, it's almost unimaginable that might be true. Is that how it works?
That is the incredible thing about eels. I mean, they come up through our river systems. So if your pond is disconnected from a river, it's an extraordinary thing that it's managed to get there, but they seem to get everywhere. You know, that's a very wonderful and mysterious thing. But yes, I mean, the topic of where European eels have come from has been the stuff of scientific debate for millennia, since Aristotle postulated that they rise from the mud. And it carried on, and really the main piece of evidence and the really exciting leap forward in putting together the puzzle that is their life cycle came from a Danish scientist 100 years ago now, really, 1923, 1924. He published his paper on the findings of collecting larval eel from the surface waters of the Atlantic. So 20 years he gathered these leptocephali, they're called. They're the tiny little eels that hatch from egg and drift across the Atlantic. And he caught them, many surveys, and he found essentially, to put it simply, that they were small over the Sargasso and they got bigger as they approached the continental shelf of Europe. And so from this, he surmised the extraordinary truth that they most probably come from the Sargasso on the western side of the Atlantic.
And so those little elvers would take 2 to 3 years to cross the Atlantic eastwards until they finally hit the shores of Britain and Europe.
As is usual with eel, there's a lot of debate and a lot of different evidence around how long that takes, that journey across the Atlantic. Modelling data suggests it might be a little bit quicker. So based on the currents, so they're drifting at this stage. They're called leptocephali when they're in the ocean, and they're sort of willow leaf shaped. And then as they approach the continental shelf, they go through their first metamorphosis, which is into glass eel. And then they move into estuaries as unpigmented. So they're absolutely beautiful. If you get a chance to see one, I don't know, you said you'll see your first eel. That was a yellow eel, right? Is that what you saw?
Yeah, the one that I saw was yellow and wriggling and about as long as my forearm. But I had actually seen glass eels before because an organisation called the Sustainable Eels Group brought a bunch of glass eels from the base of the Parrot, where they get trapped every year behind a dam, which is a topic I want to talk about in a moment. And then they deposit them upstream in various Somerset rivers. So I had been lucky enough a few years earlier to deposit on some online ponds, so ponds that are along the stream, a bunch of these little glass eels that then disappeared into the water. And I presume some of those must have crossed land into some of the offline ponds that we have here.
Yes. Yes, that's exactly right. So they're catching glass eel out just offshore. So if we go back to the life cycle, they're arriving. Formerly, they would have arrived in huge numbers, and this is something we're going to talk about: the crash in what we call recruitment. And then they very quickly, over a period of a couple of weeks, they pigment, and they get that beautiful olivey yellow colour, which you will have seen in your eel in the pond. Then we start to see the migration up into rivers, and that is a density-dependent migration. So they're essentially moving away from each other to find space to grow where there's more resource for each individual eel. And there in freshwater, they'll spend the time it takes for them to mature is temperature dependent. So if you're a European eel that arrives into the Iberian Peninsula, where the water's warmer, you'll grow faster, maybe 6-7 years. In England, maybe 15 years you'll spend in the rivers as you grow. And extraordinarily, as we're going to come across lots of extraordinary things about eels, so it's brilliant to be talking to you about them. But the sex that they eventually become, so they're all immature in freshwater. That's something that we need to bear in mind. So they only finally mature when it's time to go back to the Sargasso, and we're going to talk about that. But the density dictates what sex they become. So when they're in low density, they become female and they grow much larger, heavier animals, maybe a metre long. And in high density, which you'll probably see on your part of the country, I'm speaking to you from the Thames. So typically we get lower density of eels. You're on the west side, you get higher density, big numbers, particularly up into the 7. And they're more likely to become male. So that's one of the extraordinary things about them. And yes, as you said about right at the introduction here, that they grow and they once they achieve a particular body mass, they've got enough stored calories, enough stored energy to go all the way back to the Sargasso. That's when they migrate back out. And so the timing of the migration is they're arriving into our coastal waters about now. So depending again where you are in their range, certainly in the Thames, we're starting to see them now. So that's March, April. They're coming up into our rivers. Your side of the country slightly earlier, and then the out migration is timed. It's all energetically perfect. If you imagine this, so they're coming up when the flows are slightly lower in our rivers. In the spring, the rains have reduced, lower flows moving upstream. In theory, when there's heavier rains that come in the autumn, the adults ride those higher flows, the silvery eels, as we call them. So they go, the back goes, it's not vivid blue as you describe, but I like the idea of that. But it's a sort of slaty, bluey, grey, silver, with a very silver belly. And that is that lovely camouflage that you quite often see in marine fish. You know, the pale underside and the dark above to avoid predation. That's exactly the purpose of that. So each life stage is just beautifully adapted. You know, the olive brown of the riverbed as they go upstream, and then as they come downstream, they just, that counter shading, lovely coloration for the outward migration. And they do not feed on the 6,000, 5,000 kilometre journey back to the Sargasso. Just phenomenal, just phenomenal.
And when they get there, do we know what happens? Because I've seen it written by some people that it may be kind of a wonder of the world that has never been witnessed, a great breeding event of eels, because we're going to talk about how numerous they once were, and they still remain pretty numerous, albeit at a fraction of historic levels. So what happens when all these eels gather in the Sargasso? Where do they mate? Do they go to the deep, or what happens?
Oh my gosh, you're asking me to reveal things that no one's seen and no one knows. You know, we don't know. So we've got quite a few folk working on eel at ZSL, and one of them, a chap called Dr. Adam Piper, is an international expert in tagging marine fish, so sea trout, salmon. And him and his colleagues, they have tagged eels from the Azores. So the reason why they went to the Azores is because it's closer down to the Sargasso. And these marine tags, they're pop-off tags. They have a set period that they can stay on the back of the eels and then before they pop off. So to tag them from the Azores gives you more of a chance of seeing whether they're actually going back to the Sargasso. And they tagged eels that went back to the Sargasso region. And it's the first time that that's kind of completed this idea that Johannes Schmidt, the Danish scientist, put in train, that that's where they come from. But that's as far as we've got. No one's filmed them spawning. We have no direct evidence of them spawning there. We just know that the larvae are smallest there, and the adults seem to go back there from tagging studies.
Is it possible that these eels that spent the first chunk of their life cycle living in my pond in temperate northern Europe could possibly end up having a whole second life cycle at the bottom of the Sargasso Sea?
The essence of eel includes the fact that there's mystery. I think that's one of the wonderful things about the species. So there's still great mysteries around them. And one of the raging debates in fish science is whether they're phylopatric, so an animal that goes back to a specific location, or whether they're panmictic, so truly breeding in amongst their range. They've got a big range, all the way from North Africa up to Scandinavia. The molecular information suggests that they are panmictic, so they're total mixing amongst the adults that are spawning. But some still contest that perhaps they're particular animals from parts of their range are going to particular areas within the Sargasso.
So how do they get to the eastern parts of Europe? Because you've got this great wall of little eels being washed eastwards across the Atlantic over a long period of time. And at some moment, at exactly the right time of year, in March, April, May, they are being washed up against the west coast of Europe. So you can imagine a lot of little eels, therefore, as you said, coming up the Severn, entering the Severn estuary. How the hell do they make it to Denmark or to the eastern side of the Scandinavian countries or into the Mediterranean and up into Italian river systems? How does that happen?
Yeah, it's such a good question. I mean, the whole life cycle. So firstly, about the timing, I've said March, April, May. That's specific to Thames. So my work is largely involves working in and around Thames, the Thames and the rivers, the tributaries of the Thames. And that's the timing we see. So again, going back to the Severn, they arrive earlier. So the arrival of the animals is all related to the oceanic currents. The leptocephali are at the mercy of the currents, so they'll be washed across the range. So how they get up into the Mediterranean, there'll be fewer numbers, as there will be going up into the Scandinavian countries. What we're seeing, because of the reductions in recruitment, the numbers coming in, is actually their range is reducing. So fewer animals arriving, quite significantly, shockingly fewer animals arriving into these rivers across their range.
So it's a currents thing. The current washes in the Strait of Gibraltar and there will be some eels, but the further east you go, the lower the density, to the extent that are eel populations therefore completely disappearing in those places that never had a high density in the first place?
Exactly right. Their life cycle is, tagging studies show the adults in particular go against the currents, but if you imagine that they're coming up on the north side of the Atlantic, so they're following the great Atlantic gyre, coming up across the north and the west, washed across Europe, and then down on the southeast side of the Atlantic, so that oceanic, circular oceanic current. But as I say, there's extraordinary tagging data of adults, which seems to show them going against the current and things like that. And yes, exactly as you say, in some parts of their range, they are disappearing because fewer elvers are arriving into our rivers.
So let's talk about the sheer abundance of eels in past times. They're absolutely central to folklore and culture across Europe. Ely, where Nattergal, the company I've helped set up, has a big rewilding project named after the abundance of eels. I also read somewhere once that the eels leaving for the Sargasso were so numerous in the Severn estuary that it was as if there was no water, only eels in the river. So this was I've seen different figures, but 30, 40, maybe 50% of all freshwater fish biomass at one stage, an unbelievably numerous species. Can you describe that to me of what our generation really can't quite fathom?
Yeah, that's the point, isn't it? We can't imagine nature in such abundance, and that's a terrible thing. But yes, absolutely. The Doomsday Book describes hundreds of eel fisheries across the UK. In medieval periods, they were so important they were used as a currency. You mentioned Ely, so named because of the eel fishery there. So the eels were an incredibly valuable source of protein for people, particularly through the winter. So if you were wealthy, you had your eel pond stuffed with eels, and you would require, you'd get paid in eels to top up your eel pond. So there's a terrific book on Thames fish that goes back the last few hundred years. And there's an account of a scientist, Dr. William Roots, who in 1832, he observed the miracle of the Elver migration and saw the margins of the river going black, the Thames at Kingston. And so he tied a thread across the river, and what he found, and he was trying to count them as they were passing, which must have been an incredible task. He estimated 1,600 passing each minute, which if you then calculate that up, that's about 1.5 million elver migrating in a single day. And if you think they're coming up for 4 or 5 months, that gives you an idea of the scale of the migration that used to come into the Thames.
If it's anything like the salmon, meticulous records have been kept for several centuries on salmon. And there's one statistic that says that the total salmon catch on one river, the River Tweed, in 1822 was 1,000 times higher than the salmon catch on that same river in 1922. And the total catch on the River Tweed in 1922 of salmon was 1,000 times greater than all the salmon caught in all of Britain in 2022. So we're talking absolutely catastrophic declines in migrating fish. And how much of this can be attributed, Joe, to the blocking of our streams and rivers with millions of weirs and dams? Because there are millions across the European continent and Britain, of which a huge number are completely obsolete. They're not providing water, they're not providing electricity, they're just there because someone put them there and no one's bothered to remove them. This must be the standout catastrophe for eels.
There's a few catastrophes, that's one of a number. So just to give you the figures for eels, so there are long records that go back in certain fisheries for European eels, so we've got pretty good data. And now what's happened is that various organisations have working together within ICES, so the International Council for Exploration of the Sea. They host what's called the Working Group on Eel, and one of my colleagues in ZSL, Dr. Matthew Gollick, is part of that group. So it's a collaboration of scientists across the European eels range that gather data every year on the recruitment of eels and the numbers of young coming in. And what we see is compared to before the 1980s, so we've got two different metrics. One of them is related to the glass eel coming in from the Atlantic. And we see that is showing us that we're about just less than 10%, pretty much the last 20 years or so, a glass eel arriving. And then for elver coming up into rivers, we're bumping along around 1% of pre-1980s levels. So a catastrophic crash. And to your question about the dams, the weirs, the sluices that fragment our waterways, yes, that's clearly an issue. Although I have to say, eels are remarkable in that when they're very young, they can climb over vertical surfaces. They will be impeded by these things, but some of them will get through. But they are a major problem. But along with that, other issues include the drainage of freshwater habitats, just the loss of freshwater habitats over hundreds of years. We've removed a frightening proportion of our coastal marshes, the ditches, the ponds, and wider sort of marsh ecosystems that used to lie around European countries.
So there would have been eels literally everywhere. I mean, when the ground was much wetter and you had these pocket wetlands and larger wetlands and fens and bogs and things all over the place, you would have had so much eel habitat. So you think the loss of wetlands is as significant as these kind of artery blockers that we've put all over our rivers?
Absolutely. I mean, it's typical with lots of conservation challenges. We're looking at what we've got in front of us, but it's just a fragment of what there used to be there before. And it's degraded. So the rivers are the upstream migration is impeded for all sorts of, the eels and the salmonids that you've talked about. With sturgeon, we've got a program to try and bring back the sturgeon, and it's the same challenge that the rivers are bisected by these structures. So that's one problem. Eels clearly used to be everywhere in all those habitats, the ditches everywhere. And then, of course, we have to acknowledge that they are a critically endangered animal, and they've been listed as such for nearly 20 years, and yet they're still fished. The advice from the working group on eel is to stop that fishery temporarily and make sure we can recover the population. But they are still fished, and some of the measures that have been brought in to protect eel, like the banning of export from Europe. Now we're seeing people circumventing, criminal activity to illegally export them from Europe because they're fetching such a high price. They're in such demand.
I remember as a child, we used to get taken as a family by my dad to a little restaurant on the waterfront in the south of Spain when we were on holiday there. And they would serve little eels, I guess they were glass eels, steaming hot in a garlic sauce, and it was so hot that you ate them with a wooden fork for some reason. And I remember not quite being brave enough to eat this kind of sizzling dish, but my parents loved it. And it was only years later as an adult that I realized we were eating this species whose numbers were collapsing, and each bowl had loads of them in there because they were tiny. So are they a delicacy all over the world, these tiny eels, or are they stealing them, poaching them in order to raise them into fat eels that then can be eaten in Asian markets?
There is an enormous illegal trade, tons and tons of eels. If we think about the UK, tons of eels being shipped out illegally. And if you think 1 kilo of glass eel is, estimates vary, but I think 2,000 to 3,000 individuals in 1 kilo. They can be packed with just a little water in plastic bags and oxygen and shipped off. And the trafficking by criminal gangs who are involved in all sorts of other criminal activity is a reflection of the fact they fetch such a high price, and they're being shipped out into Asian markets and being mixed with all sorts of other eels. So what we're seeing now is, as the European eel becomes harder to get, that other anguillid eel species are being targeted. There's just a thirst and a demand for eel to be eaten at various life stages. As you say, they can be eaten as glass eel, or as they grow out as growing eels, they can be eaten at that stage too.
How many species of eel are there that have the same behavior, this kind of living out their life on freshwater wetlands and rivers and then moving out into the ocean somewhere to breed?
There's 16, I believe, species of anguillid eel, and they all have these oceanic migrations. So I think I'm right in saying that the European eel has the largest oceanic migration. Thousands of kilometres, but all anguillid eels have this life strategy, which actually, when you think about it, is not too dissimilar. Lots of marine fish come into estuaries. Their young grow in shallow estuaries. It's warmer. There's more food. There's protection from predators. This is just an extreme form of a life strategy that other marine fish exhibit.
One wonders how they found the Sargasso. Or are they so ancient that the continents drifted apart and they found their migration getting longer and longer? So what are we going to do about this, Joe? How do we as societies bring this species back from the brink? What's the plan? And are governments taking this seriously enough? It's unimaginable that we would lose eels altogether, isn't it?
I totally agree. It's, a once so ubiquitous, abundant animal, the thought of it no longer undergoing its magic journey is just horrific. And what's clear, it's a huge conservation challenge, because you think about all the different countries involved, all the different stakeholders, all the different people that need to work together, and that's why we work at it from multiple directions. So at ZSL we've got, as I mentioned, we've got Matthew Gollock, who works within the UN conventions for eel. So they are listed as CITES Appendix 2, so the trade is regulated. They're part of the Convention of Migratory Species, so CITES being legally binding, Convention of Migratory Species not legally binding, but it pulls together different countries involved in their conservation. And then from our perspective, the work that I'm involved with is more at catchment, at river basin scale. So it's trying to do the best we can. For us, it's within the Thames to hold as many eels in it as possible that can grow up and migrate back to the Sargasso. And the primary focus for us in that regard is to connect the remaining wetland habitat. So all the rivers, you mentioned the dams, the weirs, they need to be passable so eels can move up freely to access as much habitat as possible. And we have been building eel passes, as have lots of other organisations. But also all the water bodies that line those rivers need to be connected too, so eels can move in and out freely.
So the challenges are stop them being fished, protect them properly, and then reconnect their habitat all the way from the estuaries up to the smaller streams and tributaries of river systems like the Thames. Create as much connected habitat as possible.
Yes, that's our focus in the Thames. Yeah.
How long have you worked on the Thames, Joe?
Well, we have a Thames programme going back to 2004, and the first project within that programme is to monitor the upstream migration of the eel, and we evidenced that crash. You know, in 2011, we published a paper that shows in the River Roding in East London a 98% crash in recruitment. And, you know, as we talked about those figures, that crash has remained over those 17 years since the publication of that paper.
So the eels haven't disappeared completely. They're hovering at those very low levels with no real sign of recovery yet.
No, that's exactly right. They are hovering is the word, just bouncing around that sort of 10% for glass eel and 1% for elvers coming up into rivers. Yeah.
And how big an issue is water quality for eels? I've got to say, the pond in which I fished out an eel, I mean, it's got a little bit of cow dung in it, and it's a typical farmy pond quite close to where our buildings are, and the eels seem perfectly happy to me. So I wonder, is that a factor?
It's remarkable. We monitor the upstream migration through a number of different tributaries in the Thames, and to us it looks like they are positively selecting perhaps the more nutrient-loaded rivers, which from a resource perspective, maybe that stands to reason, because if you're a sort of productive environment with lots of nutrients in it, might equal lots of food for eel, but they seem robust to pollution.
That's fantastic. So they may even like the rivers that have got a little bit more slurry or even sewage in it.
Yeah, I wouldn't go that far, but we have to be careful as well, because of course there's more insidious chemicals that are masked, behind those nutrients that accumulate in fatty tissues, endocrine disrupting chemicals that we're more and more becoming aware of in our rivers, and those are a concern.
Joe, you left the ZSL for a period of years to do some other things before going back after working with organisations like the London Wildlife Trust. Has the Thames, during that long amount of time that you focused on it, got significantly cleaner?
Over the last 5 years, we've published 2 iterations of our State of the Thames report, which is a document that aggregates data sets from multiple different organisations, including the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, the Environment Agency, and it shows a mixed picture. So, interestingly, some of the nutrients that we've just talked about, like phosphate, for instance, is coming down. Flows are a concern, but fundamentally what's not really being seen is the recovery of species and habitats that we need to see at scale to support the resilience of the ecosystem.
So while we're on the subject of the Thames and the London Wildlife Trust, we must give a shout out to the wonderful Matthew Frith, who's sadly no longer with us, but who campaigned tirelessly for his whole life for nature and wildlife in London. And it was with Matthew that a group of us got together and set up the Rewilding London Task Force under Sadiq Khan, which has done lots of great things. And Matthew really was an inspiration and a driving force in all of that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And Matthew was so missed. I mean, he was an inspiration, an incredible cyclopedic knowledge of London species and London wild places, and so dedicated, so very much missed. And it's interesting that we are indebted to you, Ben, because you set up the Rewilding Task Force. And actually, over the last year, I've been involved with Matthew, of course, at the helm, as he was then, with the working group for Rewilding London. And we've selected some sites, some big scale sites to rewild. And it will be lovely if that ambition can be taken forward in Matthew's memory. That would be a fantastic thing to do.
Well, he's a total hero. I'm going to see Wild Tolworth and also the Ealing Beaver Project with Citizen Zoo. They're two of those projects that have been supported under the Rewilding London Task Force. And of course, beavers are highly relevant to eels, one must assume, because the wetland habitat just on my place here at Canwood in South Somerset that's been created along the valley just by the activities of beavers must represent significant and vibrant eel habitat. So are you a beaver believer with your eel hat on?
I am 100% a beaver believer. In fact, we worked, Citizens are doing wonderful things. We worked with them on the Tolworth Court Farm. We supported the development of the wetland there. Our team in London is all about the freshwater habitat, so we were delighted to support the development of that wetland. And the example set at Paradise Fields is just fantastic. It's on a pretty stinky, miserable tributary, the Colston Brook, I think it is, of the Brent. And we went there and we did some baseline water quality assessments of the Colston Brook and also the wider environment, looking at the wider environment. And the ecological impact of those beavers is just amazing in the creation of the wetlands. But also what's so interesting is the social response. So the site now is so beautifully cared for. It was strewn when we first went there to take our water quality samples. The site was strewn with rubbish and clearly sort of degraded and uncared for. And the pride now, I think, in that project and the fact that all eyes are on it and the impact of it in spreading, there's beaver sites now being talked about in Croydon, in Redbridge, I believe. There's it's so exciting, and we're supporting that, and we're working across London with Citizen Zoo and others to also follow up with water voles. So we've got the London Water Vole Recovery Programme that, for us, the eel is, it's magic and critical in its own right, but also as a flagship species for the recovery of rivers. That's one of the ways that we work with eel.
Joe, are there beavers on the Thames yet? Wild living ones? Because there are rumours of beavers on the Kennet, on the Glyme, rumours I also heard on the Lee Valley. Have you heard any of these rumours, and is it true?
I've heard all these rumours. Of course, if they're not there now, they're coming. We know, don't we? There's quite good numbers in Kent, free-living beaver. They will be here. And the important thing is that we get ready for that and we develop the social processes and that we need to be ready. Yeah, it's exciting times.
Thank goodness, Joe, for the work of the Zoological Society of London and the London Wildlife Trust and all the organisations out there that are working on eels, which are intrinsically linked to the health of our watercourses and the quality of and abundance of our wetland habitats. And eels are, for me, emblematic of these things. And beavers are a very important, for a beaver believer like me, a very important engineer in helping towards those goals. And thank you, Joe, so much for everything you do and for taking the time to join me on the podcast to talk about one of my favourite animals, which is the European eel.
Thank you so much, Ben. That's very generous of you, and I'm really delighted to have been able to talk about eels with you. Thank you.
I can't think of a better symbol of nature decline in Britain and Europe than the massive disappearance of European eels, which was once so abundant. If we can't get that right, what can we get right? I really enjoyed that conversation with Joe. He's devoting his life to saving this species and doing such a good job. He's a hero. If you're enjoying my Rewilding the World podcast, and if you've got any feedback or ideas you'd like to give me, please do fill out the listener survey, which you'll find in the show notes. Next time, I'm going to be talking to my friend Craig Bennett, who is a lifelong conservationist and activist who is now running one of the most important nature organisations in Britain, the Wildlife Trusts. And under Craig's leadership, the Wildlife Trust has become a huge force for rewilding and nature restoration up and down the country.